of the novel, what were your first impressions and how enthusiastic were you about the story and about the writer, and how did that develop then throughout the novel?
Originally with the novel, I felt almost as though my intelligence was insulted because Rushdie tended to take a more simplistic view with his writing, whereas I'm used to a lot of elevated syntax, higher level diction, complex sentence structures. And instead, he was reading it almost as though it was to a third grader that wasn't even really that high of a lexile. Especially in certain moments like where he felt the need to clarify certain conclusions, such as why Haroun was unable to keep his attention focused for more than 11 minutes, going on to say, it's because his mother left at 11. I felt slightly insulted. But then as the book progressed, I kind of began to tune out this idea that it was an insult to me and that his writing style was instead meant to get across the story versus the thought of reading it. And I ended up quite thoroughly enjoying this story, going, wait, no, this can't be done yet. This is not supposed to be over yet. No.
So you've already talked about what the writer did that you felt was simplistic. Mm-hmm. What did he do to then change your mind? What about the writing made you change your mind then?
I think the interesting thing that I only realized in later chapters was that his writing was mimicking the environment that the character was in. In the beginning, he talks about how the Shah of Blah and Haroun were in the land of Alphabet and was this bland place where sadness is manufactured. And I don't know about you, but I get fairly sad when people insult my intelligence. But it also has this bland feeling to the way he words, and he creates imagery for the environment, but no meaning to certain things. Whereas later, when Haroun goes into the dream world and is, accompanying his fellow soldiers, for lack of a better term, against Shah Alud, it becomes more about the waiting behind the scene than the actual scene itself, such as the constant use of gold when he's referring to Blabbermouth, such as the idea of shadows being the removal of the story and the darkness in the world. And so the environment is more reflected in how he worded it then than how it was blah at the very beginning and end. And in the end, even when Haroun goes back to the land of Alphabet, he still has a different viewpoint and is instead now a mixture, almost a chimera, of the two different aspects of the world.
I like that he becomes a mixture of the two different aspects of the world. I think there are other characters as well on the Moon of Kahini that blend those two different worlds, blend the shadows and the light, and blend the idea of silence and communication. Mm-hmm. Which characters pop out to you from the Moons of Kahini that represent that blending?
I believe the two that come to mind the most would be Blabbermouth, who is, rather than being enthralled with simply the idea of light, happiness, and sunshine, she tends to take a more Medicean point of view, more Machiavellian point of view, saying that, in her opinion, that ends do justify the means. You need to focus on the goal at hand. And she tends to do whatever she feels is necessary, even if it means turning to the other side for the disqualified, darkened shadow warrior. She tends to look at the life around her as something simply to get her to an end point. She doesn't necessarily try to focus on the moment and the joys of a moment as much as she attempts to create how she sees fit. Such as when a dignitary was brought into base camp when they were meaning to attack the City of Shadows, and he brought a bomb with her. She was the only one who noticed him juggling the bomb, and rather than listening to her superiors throughout the library as she was expected, she instead took it upon herself to use her juggling skills to snatch the bomb out of the air and go across the hill, risking her life to dispose of it.
You said there were two characters that came to mind.
Oh, yes. The disgraced Shadow Warrior. He was originally part of this idea of darkness and the loss of stories, but instead is trying to lend to this idea of balance throughout the book. He isn't as much major about it as Blabbermouth is, but he still lends an important amount, as he is kind of who opens up Haroon's eyes to the fact that no story has just one side, which lends to the whole idea of the book of stories.
No story has just one side, and this book is very obviously focused on stories. So if the side that we are experiencing the most of is the side of the guppies and the light and talking all the time, what is the other side and how is it represented?
I think the Chipwalas are meant to represent this idea of no longer caring for not just stories as a whole, but for the simplicity of them, for the way that they can create entirely new worlds, and for this idea of the information they can give. The Shah of Blah, he was asked to write campaign stories in order to help sway people's votes, in order to help sway people's minds, because stories aren't, even if they're fictional or non-fictional, always tend to have a weight to them that tend to sway others. And I think that in the end, the Chipwalas were showing this idea that it's more that peoples were becoming too focused on the right then, right there, right now, than thinking about how things can actually be.
It's interesting that you say that the Chipwalas seem to no longer care for the simplicity of stories. There's a question that's asked again and again within Herman and the Sea of Stories, and that's what's the use of stories that aren't even true. So I'm going to twist that a little bit. What's the use of stories that are so simplistic and are almost insulting your intelligence?
I think it kind of lends back to that idea of when we're all children and we read those little Dr. Seuss books and things that try to state things in a more fun manner, but are also very simplistically styled, because sometimes a story with its meaning behind it doesn't need a bunch of higher level words. It doesn't need to be complex or thoroughly written to be, 1,000 pages. Sometimes in the end it can just become this small little anecdote that is passed, and it also removes any chance for it to be manipulated or mutated from the passing of the story.
What's then the point that Rushdie is making? What is his concept of why this book, Haroon and the Sea of Stories, is important?
I believe his concept, kind of relating to his life, is this idea that we cannot simply censor ourselves, and instead we need to understand that there is no just a single set of viewpoints. There will always be multiple viewpoints, which he kind of explained in the final chapters, where the Chipwalas were beginning to fall to the side of the guppies. And especially as the castle began to fall and they were all cheering, it wasn't simply a single side. It's this idea that, relating to his political outstanding and his political outcast and exile, that there is no way to truly censor a story, and that it is the story itself, it is the beliefs that come from each story that are most important versus the political assignment that someone has.
And